Hello, welcome to CashcroftTV. My name is Kalen Ashcroft. Thanks for watching another video on history of leaders of thought. Today we will be doing Socrates and Thucydides. So to sort of reference a philosophy from Plutarch, so Plutarch in his Life of Alexander, he notes that there are so many battles and so many details that he can't really go through and explain everything. So he really wanted to push at the essence of who the person was as an individual rather than stick to too many facts, because that is the most learning more about who the person was would be the most instructive or the most valuable in terms of shaping one's own life. So in the case of Socrates and Thucydides, in Socrates' case, there was so much writing about him, namely from Plato and Xenophon, that it would be impossible to cover this all in one video. And same case for Thucydides. He has so much writing, particularly his writings on the Peloponnesian War, it would be impossible to cover the whole thing in this video. So I'm sort of going to focus more on their sort of biography and who they were as a person. So maybe you can sort of derive, and as you go into further readings on these two individuals, you can sort of have a nice lens to look at these pieces of writing through. So yeah, let's start off with Socrates, because he was actually born, well, according to the most currently accurate information we have, he was supposedly born about 10 years earlier than Thucydides, so very similar time, but I have not found anything about any of the two individuals actually communicating with each other, but they lived largely during the same time and during the same sort of political landscape, and we'll see how these sort of intertwine in the comparison that I will be presenting at the end, and comparison and contrastion. Yeah. So, as you might know, Socrates did not actually have any writing, because he taught, or he did all of his sort of philosophical work through dialogues, or through sort of arguments, you could call it. So all of the information that we have about him is from novels or dialogues written by Plato and Xenophon. So Xenophon was more of a historian, Plato was more of a philosopher, and there's some information also. Aristotle also talks about him a lot too, but Aristotle was a student of Plato, so once again it's secondhand information. So Socrates sort of has a special place in my heart personally, because one of the first books, and I thought I'd bring this just to show you, it was The Republic of Plato was one of the very first philosophical books I read, probably after Machiavelli's The Prince, and obviously it's written by Plato, but the main character, the one who does all the dialogue, is Socrates. So I'll talk about two of my sort of favorite, or most the passages that have stuck with me at the end after I sort of go through his biographical information. So he was born in Athens, and it said he was born in the Alcibiades tribe. So Athens at the time was divided into 10 tribes, and Alcibiades happened to be outside of the city walls. So from that you can derive that he wasn't very wealthy. He obviously wasn't part of the oligarchic class. And to kind of give a little outline of the political landscape of Athens at the time, they were going through a sort of clash between the democratic group and the oligarchs. So the Democrats were sort of getting a lot more power, and they were starting to exile a lot of powerful people, and even in many cases kill them. So there was a lot of sort of civil disputes. And you'll see how Socrates obviously had a huge role in this, being the probably leading intellectual at the time. It said his father, whose name was Sophroniscus, was a stonemason or a sculptor, and supposedly he worked on some of the female demigods in terms of their carving on the Acropolis. So he probably had a pretty, was at least in some ways artistic, but he was also probably good with his hands, so he also knew how to do labor and such, which is I think an important trait. His mother's name was Phaenarit, and she was notably had a large influence on his own life, and his most notable wife is Xanthippe, or was Xanthippe, and she was known for having a poor temperament or a poor attitude, and he had 3 children, and perhaps a couple of them were with this other wife called Myrto, but that's also sort of disputed, but he obviously had children, so he had some sort of legacy, and who knows, if you're watching this, you might even be a descendant in some way of Socrates, so that's kind of a cool thing. While young, he trained in carving like his father in stonemasonry, and yeah, it's likely he lived in Athens his whole life, especially considering all the writings, especially noted in Plato's and Xenophon's writing. All of his life pretty much takes place in Athens, from supposedly life until death. It's except for the exclusion that he served as a hoplite, which is sort of just a general soldier in the Peloponnesian War, which is a war fought between Athens and Sparta. And supposedly he was a good soldier, and Laches, one of the generals, really approved of his efforts. And there's one individual named Alcibiades who's pictured here in this photo by Regnault, and this painting by Regnault, and also here as well. That's Alcibiades. So Alcibiades is one of my favorite characters in Plutarch's Lives. So obviously a real individual, and he was a student of Plutarch's. But supposedly a student of Socrates. But supposedly during the Peloponnesian War, Socrates actually saved his own life. But not to go on too much of a tangent here, but Alcibiades was Socrates' sort of most challenging student. So Alcibiades was obviously a very great general and a very flamboyant individual in terms of politics. He was very pro-oligarchy. Socrates sort of saw him as a challenge. He saw that Socrates was obsessed with women. He was always having here's the painting of Socrates pulling Alcibiades away from this sort of orgy he seems to be having. So he's always partying, always drinking, but he saw that he had a lot of potential, and he sort of took him under his wing and really tried to teach him. Whether he ultimately succeeded or ultimately failed is hard to say, but he was even there, Alcibiades, at his deathbed. So very interesting relationship there, and you can learn a little bit more about that in the life of Alcibiades, which I covered previously. Another anecdote in terms of his life, there was this trial of commanders. So there were 6 commanders who were considered to be traitors during the Peloponnesian War, and the people wanted to have them put to death. And the sort of council, which Socrates at the time was actually the head of, did not want to vote on it. And the people, this might have sort of led into Socrates' sort of anti-democratic stance, which I'll expand on in a bit. But the people wanted to kill these 6 commanders, and since the council refused, they threatened to kill the council. So all the council members stood down, but Socrates stood up and said, he had to represent the rule of law, and ultimately the commanders did get killed. Even one of Pericles' relatives got killed, and Pericles was a very powerful oligarch in Rome at the time. But the point was that, and as we'll see later, Socrates wasn't afraid to risk his own life. And we can also see another parallel too, when he risked his own life to save Alcibiades. So throughout his whole life, and even up until the end, which we'll ultimately see in his own death, he was not afraid to risk his life. And it's said that even in his defending politics, defending his philosophy was very parallel to defending one's own life in battle. One must fight to the death, and that's ultimately what he does. So what sort of happened in terms of his trial? So he was very, I wouldn't say, right, I think most people, when they think of democracy, anything that isn't democracy is obviously monarchy or dictatorship. But in Athens at the time, it was sort of part of the political spectrum. Democracy was just sort of left-leaning ideals. And they were kind of going through a phase sort of similar as you could have seen in the Soviet Union, where there was obviously a lot of wealthy upper-class people who had the majority of the wealth, but the lower-class people wanted to sort of take it from them. And Socrates really feared their potential and feared their intentions. In fact, he went so far as to say that that the people should only be ruled by the intelligent, and he thought that the masses sort of had no rationality, and so he was sort of considered anti-democracy, but probably not in the modern sense. Just like today, anyone who says they're anti-democracy would be crazy, but technically we live in a republic, not a full democracy. But democracy is sort of it's an absolute, in that you can there are different levels of democracy. So he was, but for the times, he was very anti-democratic and pro-oligarchy because he feared their intentions. And yeah, so ultimately he got into a lot of trouble because at one time his friend went to the Oracle of Delphi, which was sort of like just the oracle. It was like probably the main religious influence in the region at the time, and it was most of the time in Greece autonomous, and that was one of the main things that came out of many of the wars in Greece at the time. But one of his friends went there and he asked the oracle who is the wisest man in the land, and he said Socrates. And Socrates thought, no way. So he went around consulting people, consulting the top rhetorics, individuals who spoke in terms of best orators, I suppose, the best politicians, and he found that everyone who thought they were smart was actually not smart or not wise, and it was sort of a paradox. The wiser they thought they were, the stupider they actually were. So he started to get very critical, and he started to attack many intellectuals, and he started to be seen as corrupting the minds of the people and impious. And it's you can't really pinpoint it on one specific occasion that really upset the people, but he was sort of a scapegoat for a certain way of thinking, which was sort of pro the oligarchic class, and pro Alcibiades, who Alcibiades ultimately got exiled, or Alcibiades at one point was sentenced to death and he ran away. So eventually Socrates, they asked Socrates, what should your punishment be? And he says, I think free meals and you pay me for all the aid I've given you. So obviously they didn't like that. So eventually he gets sentenced to death. So one of his friends actually gives him the option, and many of his friends could have paid for him to escape and left, and rather than be killed. And there are many reasons why maybe he didn't do it. One is that if he left, his friends would be put at risk. Another is that if he couldn't accomplish his objectives in Athens, there's no way he could accomplish it anywhere else, so what's the point? It's also said that since he chose to live in Athens, he bought into a social contract, so therefore he had to respect the laws, and that was sort of important. But I think most of all, he wanted to just prove a message and kind of make a martyr of himself. So kind of proving that democracy can get carried away. And I think I was having a discussion with a friend of mine about the death penalty, and I'm not going to tell you my absolute stance on it because I love to argue both sides, and I think it's just a lot of fun, and I don't even know where I ultimately do stand on it. But one argument sort of against the death penalty is that the people use the government as a scapegoat to commit murder. So strangely enough, even though a lot of these people probably en masse hated Socrates and they sentenced him to death, individually would any of them kill them? Probably not. So in that one of the problems with democracy is that they could use the government as a scapegoat to accomplish things that they would not do otherwise. So ultimately he's sentenced to death, and he is forced to drink hemlock poison. And sort of what specifically happened was they made him walk around after he drank the poison until he could walk no longer, and then he fell down on the bed, and the physician pinched his foot and he no longer had feeling, and it slowly climbed up his body. And some of his last lines were that this was one of them: all philosophy is training for death. So this was sort of something he had probably perhaps planned. He probably thought many times about death and how it might look to him, and this did not seem like such a bad way. He had 3 kids, a lot of great students, a great influence, and to go out in the peak of his life. I didn't mention he was considered quite an ugly individual, although brilliant. I don't really know how that relates, but he sort of died at the peak of his life, not at the peak of his beauty, I suppose. But yeah, and at a perfect time to make an influence, and probably it was a very against the democratic stance at the time. Another one of his last this was supposedly his very last quote. So he says, Crito, which was one of his friends, "We owe a rooster to Asclepius. Please don't forget to pay the debt." So Asclepius was the son of Apollo, the god of medicine. So what he's saying, and it's kind of sort of a joke, or maybe it was serious, he meant that for drinking the poison they had to pay back the gods. So he got free poison out of the whole case. So it's sort of once again very critical individual. Xenophon says, in terms of, so he was considered impious, so that was one of the other reasons he got killed, and impiety was obviously a difficult thing, especially in Greece at the time. Maybe he wasn't even impious, maybe it was just slander. Xenophon says he was a telogist, which believed that God arranges everything for the best, so he was very much an optimist, and he has and that was maybe perhaps one of the reasons he was killed, that he had a different stance on God from other people. It said he maybe believed in reincarnation, but he probably did not believe in the pantheon of God. Not Xenophon, but Xenophanes was one of the first to outwardly speak about oppose the gods. He said if the horses had invented a god, they would make the god look like a horse. So he thought it was strange that they had like a bunch of gods who were intermingling, sort of like some kind of sitcom, and they would cheat, they would engage in adultery, and they did all kinds of things that were sort of a god should not do. So perhaps Socrates was impious as well. Maybe he ascribed to some of those beliefs as well. But that was probably not the main reason he was killed. It was probably mainly for political reasons and his opposition of the democratic class. So I talked briefly about his philosophy, or his beliefs, before moving on to Thucydides and the comparison. In terms of the Socratic method, it's had a huge influence on pretty much all learning to this day. Most law schools are based on this as well, and it's based on dialect, so through arguments. It's called, specifically in his case, elenchus, and most of his dialogues relate to good and justice, and they solve problems through questioning. And you can see that if you read any of Plato's books in which Socrates speaks. And what they do is they try to the philosopher keeps asking the sort of a patient, almost a question to sort of dig at their underlying objectives. And it's kind of considered a negative method in that it's hypothesis elimination. So it doesn't create a hypothesis and then try to refute it. It tries to find a hypothesis through refutation. So his personal influences, it said he was probably influenced by Anaxagoras and Proteus, who was a rhetor. And it's also said that he had a couple women who heavily influenced his life, namely Diotima, who was a priestess, and supposedly she taught him the concept of eros, or love. So maybe he was having a side affair, or maybe it was a different reference to love, perhaps the love of wisdom or something of the sort. And Aspasia, who was actually one of Pericles' mistress, taught him a lot of rhetoric. So also he had probably very much respected women. He had 2 wives. One of the wives was apparently pretty cruel, so obviously he was probably not the wearing the pants in that relationship. So I suppose he was more respectful to women than probably was common at the time. He has these what are called the Socratic Paradoxes. So there are like 4 major ones, and I don't even know if I would personally call them a paradox, but they're basically I'll explain after I read them. No one desires evil is the first one. No one errs or does wrong willingly or knowingly. Virtue, all virtue is knowledge. Virtue is sufficient for happiness. So they're paradoxes in that they pretty much cannot be true. So no one desires evil, then how is there evil in the world? Virtue is sufficient for happiness. Well then, why are there so many people unhappy? But they're still nonetheless called his paradoxes. But I think it could be true, maybe. And we'll see this more in Thucydides, who talks a lot about the nature of man. But in this sense, Socrates was very much an optimist. He thought that, for example, even with his belief in God, that God does everything for the best. But he thought all people wanted the best, and they were just sort of, they lacked the intellect or lacked the wisdom to know or to do what was best. In terms of virtue, he says that it was the most important pursuit. Here's a quote, "The unexamined life is not worth living. Ethical virtue is the only thing that matters." So he thought that the search of wisdom and the search of learning is the most important thing that one can attribute their life to. In terms of politics, as mentioned earlier, ideas belong to the world in a world only the wise men can understand. So that's also written up here. So he thought, and as you might see in Plato's Republic, he thought that so firstly he thought that the society should be segregated. So there should be like a warrior class, there should be a sort of merchant class, and within the warrior class, the leader among them should also be a philosopher. So to lead society, you also have to be the most learned individual, and they could be handpicked from a young age and trained to do so. But he thought that most people would not be fit to rule this state, and he proves that through varying a great number of dialogues. At one point, and sorry to jump around in terms of the timeline, there were what's called the 30 tyrants. So the 30 tyrants tried to overthrow the democracy and put it back into an oligarchy, and they managed to do so for 1 year. But although Socrates was very against democracy, he actually did not support these individuals. So maybe it's because he thought they weren't intelligent enough. So going back to what I said earlier, he's not completely he wasn't against democracy, but maybe you could just say he was not pro the democracy. So I think there's an important distinction between the two. In terms of divination, he believed he heard inner voices telling him what to do, and that's maybe one of the reasons an inner voice told him to drink the poison and make a martyr of himself. And he also believed in a lot of sacrificial rituals and stuff, but I'll talk more about that in two specific references I'll be talking about, or one specific reference. In terms of his influence, obviously there are numerous huge influence on Plato and the other, pretty much any post-Socratic philosopher. Zeno of Citium, who's a sophist, pretty much took the Socratic beliefs and incorporated asceticism into it to make it into sophism. The huge influence on some of the oligarchs such as Alcibiades and Critias in Athens at the time, and even today most educational systems like law schools and ethics classes are based on sort of the Socratic method, sort of dealing through dialogue and dealing through hypothesis elimination. So just obviously, since I can't cover every single writing on Socrates, nor have I even read every writing on Socrates, but two specific dialogues that I've remembered for a long time, one that I agree with and one that I don't agree with. So starting with the one that I agree with, so there's a dialogue, it's sort of at a dinner party at a wealthy man's house, and everyone's sort of gathered around because Socrates at the time was sort of like a celebrity because he was the most learned man or the most wise man in Athens at the time. So he's talking to this, he goes through and sort of talks to different individuals throughout the room, and at one point he's talking to the old sort of patriarch of the family, and he's sort of talking about the concept of wealth, because Socrates was not really too into earning wealth. He sort of managed to earn a healthy living and wealthy living for himself just by association, but he never really engaged in any sort of industrialism or any sort of business practices. But anyways, he said, what is the highest virtue of creating wealth? Essentially, to sort of paraphrase the argument. And the individual says, the best reason, obviously, like to buy a nice couch is not a good reason, but he says it's so I can sacrifice to the gods, which would have been probably the most virtuous thing you could have done with your wealth. And then he sort of breaks it down, so as sort of hypothesis elimination, he says, well, what if you earned the wealth from malpractice and then you use it to do a sacrifice or something? Is that really redemption? And it sort of proved no, because it just sort of balances you out, so that's obviously not right. But then if you earn the wealth through good practices and then you sacrifice, well, then is that even fair? Like, would the gods appreciate that if you were sacrificing for you had an unfair advantage to sacrifice? So basically he sort of shuts down the notion that there is any sort of virtue in attaining wealth other than sort of a frivolous endeavor. In terms of like another, so one of Obviously, as I said, there was so much writing, you could spend your whole lifetime reading Socrates, and even if you did that, you would never actually be Socrates, because you still wouldn't know everything he ever believed. But I think the most important thing about anything is to, you can't be an ideologue, you can't believe every single philosophy or every single thing that any one individual says. I think a good question that I like to ask people is, who do you respect most, or who do you admire most as an intellectual? And then tell me something that you disagree with them for a lot. And a lot of people actually can't answer that. So, for example, they might say, X and X philosopher, I love this person, they've inspired everything about me. But then they realize that they have no unique ideas anyways, and they're just a sort of ideologue. So anyways, in terms of something I disagree with Socrates on, so he asks, so in terms of the warrior class, so he divides the people up into different societies, and he says, to sort of paraphrase it, what type of music should the warriors be listening to? Should they be listening to like lazy music or sad music? Do you think that'll help them on the battlefield? And is that good for the state if they're listening to romantic music when they're about to be going to battle? And he said, and the people obviously agree no. And also he said that there has to be alignment between the lyrics and the tonality. So it can't be like very soft, but like kill, like it just couldn't. Basically, he thought that the warrior should only listen to glorious music because it would thus benefit the state the most. Where I disagree with that is, firstly, I think that's a little bit too much censorship, so a little bit too much to the right, sort of alluding to his oligarchic beliefs. But also, I think that in terms of development, I also saw this other individual. It was a comedy sketch, and he was saying that he only liked to listen. It was Joe Rogan. You probably are familiar with the individual, and he said that, life is short. Only listen to happy music. Don't listen to sad music. But I think that you could develop. You need to listen to all types of music to sort of develop. That's why, like, obviously, most great pieces of literature are actually tragedies, and they teach you sort of how to live, and they teach you about different beliefs, because sometimes you will have bad thoughts, and if you realize that other people have bad thoughts too, it'll be good. So I think if there were a warrior class and you do want to make the most developed or most virtuous warriors, I don't think it would be too detrimental to sort of let them listen to their own music for two principles. Firstly, censorship would obviously be wrong, but secondly, I also think the soldiers would be better off overall if they were sort of exposed to multiple states. Obviously, they might end up being overly empathetic and not want to kill those Spartan enemies, but yeah. Either way, moving to Thucydides, and I'll talk more about Socrates in the comparison as well. So Thucydides is considered the father of scientific history, or the father of political realism, and he differed from. So here's actually a picture of his head and Herodotus's head being put head to head, literally head to head, in terms of their comparison. So whereas both of them used sort of for his eyewitness reports to tell about their history, Thucydides avoided any sort of influence from the gods, and it was sort of purely scientific, and that's why he's considered the father of scientific history, and thus the reason I included him in this series and not Herodotus and not other individuals such as Homer. So, like Socrates, he was born in Athens. However, unlike Socrates, he was actually very, very wealthy. His father owned gold mines in Thrace, so that obviously very much helped him in his upbringing. And not much is known about his own life, which is kind of unfortunate, because like many of these individuals, those who write so much often neglect to write about themselves. So sort of sad in his case, but a few facts are known. He definitely fought in a war. He contracted the plague at one point, and Pericles ultimately died and he supported Pericles, but he contracted the plague, but he actually lived through it, and he was exiled. And we'll get to this all as we go through. So because he had a gold mine in Thrace, and so he was so wealthy in Thrace, he became general of the region during the Peloponnesian War. So this was also, the Peloponnesian War was going on during Socrates' time as well, so he became the general of the region. And at one point, he failed to save this town called Amphipolis, which was about half a day's march away. So, and from Brasidas, who was one of the Spartan generals. So obviously, as mentioned before, the Peloponnesian War was a war fought between Sparta and Athens. Prior to the war, Athens sort of had a hegemony, pretty much control over the whole region of Greece, but Sparta sort of took that from them coming to the end of the Peloponnesian War. Partially also because Athens was having so much political struggles of its own and having such a democratic shift. So the powerful people were losing their power and they couldn't get anything done. And as a result, he was he lost the region of Amphipolis, and supposedly the only reason he lost it was just because it was too far. It was beyond his physical capacities. But either way, the people of Athens really shunned him, and they ultimately exiled him. So, like Socrates, the people sort of threw him around to the gutter and started to despise him, specifically the Democrats in the region. It's said that maybe he was related to Cimon, so Cimon is one of the famous heroes in Plutarch's Lives, so you can watch the video on him as well. And once again, his father, Olorus, who owned the gold mines, was possibly even Thracian royalty, despite the fact that Thucydides ended up living in Athens. But yeah, ultimately in terms of his death, so he was exiled, so he was general for a bit, and then he didn't meet the Democrats' objectives, possibly objectives that were impossible, and he was exiled. So he spent the rest of the time sort of going around between people on the Athenian side of the war, the Peloponnese, and sort of just wrote about it, and that's how he developed his history of the Peloponnesian War, which is probably the number one source on the topic. And obviously Plutarch probably he did reference it many times, and probably read through it many times as well. And so that's sort of his life. Eventually, so in terms of his death, on the one time he's heading back to Athens and some Democrats just kill him. So obviously this is why probably Socrates and Thucydides both sort of got a hate for the Democrats, because they were obviously more violent. People always think that it's going to be the oligarchs or the capitalists who are going to kill everyone. But it's more likely, and throughout history, especially looking at communist history or socialist history, it's usually the poor and the masses who do the killing. Same thing, the Reign of Terror in France as well, in the French Revolution. It's usually the masses who do the murdering. And Socrates and Thucydides both saw this and both suffered from it as well. So, yeah, ultimately he was killed by the Democrats. It's said that even his book on the Peloponnesian War he didn't even get to finish it, and apparently Xenophon, the same Xenophon who wrote about Socrates, maybe even had to finish this book for him, and it was ultimately divided into 8 volumes in the Library of Alexandria, which was unfortunately destroyed. But nonetheless, he sort of got his politics and his beliefs out there embedded in history. So it's considered, as mentioned, he was the first true historian and used eyewitness testimonies, unlike Herodotus, but he didn't use any sort of deities or fictional elements. So he's sort of the first scientific historian. And the main sort of takeaway from this, and kind of contrary to, so here's a quote by Nietzsche, and I'll get into what I'm about to say in a second. In Thucydides, the portrayer of man, the culture of the most impartial knowledge of the world finds its last glorious flower. So Nietzsche here is congratulating him for being impartial. So Thucydides believed that man was sort of just cruel and less changed by the environment, just driven by sort of animal-like instincts. And he also later, Thomas Hobbes, who's one of my favorite philosophers, who wrote the Leviathan, he was one of the first to translate Thucydides from Greek to English. Thomas Hobbes writes that life is is brutish and short, and that is something that Thucydides really demonstrates in his history of the Peloponnese. So he sort of portrays man not as some sort of glorious individual, and it's said that he chose to write about the Peloponnesian War because it was not the most important, but the most violent in the world at the time. So, and he really portrays, and that's why, kind of contrast Nietzsche here. Nietzsche obviously probably believed in his sentiment about human nature and humans being ultimately cruel when unchecked, but I disagree in that it was completely impartial. I think that he was trying to prove something, and I think it sort of had his sort of anti-democratic beliefs embedded in it. He wanted to prove that man can be evil and less controlled, and I think also another individual who was heavily influenced by him, and as I mentioned before, probably the first book on, I think the first book on philosophy that I ever read was Machiavelli's The Prince. When he was exiled, or when he lost his post, he actually wrote in favor of the government, whereas when Thucydides was exiled, he wrote out of favor. And I think there was a lot of partiality in his writing, so I disagree with Nietzsche on that, but I agree probably, or in some sense, in his sentiment. I guess to go into the quotes here, the secret to happiness is freedom, and the secret to freedom is courage. So courage, and that's what he very much showed in opposing the Democrats in Athens, obviously putting his own life at risk. History is philosophy teaching by example. So I really love this quote. I had a talk with my friend the other day, and we were talking about, they were saying that they were pretty well educated on all the sort of mainstreams of thought, that being science, that being philosophy, that being, arts or whatnot, but they didn't really find much of a need to study history because it was done. So and this idea sort of popped into my head as I was saying it. I was talking about, Plutarch mentions Alexander the Great said that everything one needs to know can be found in Homer, the Iliad or the Odyssey. And that's important because, well, it's sort of more fiction, but everything you can learn about people can be found in fiction. So you want to know what it's like to be heartbroken, read some Shakespeare. You want to know what it's like to be glorious, read some Homer. But the special part about history is, history obviously is huge. It's a huge plethora of literature. But the very special part about history is, not only are all the lessons already in history, all the potential emotional states and all the potential feelings one can have, history just happens to be true. And I really like that. And you can read all kinds of fiction, all kinds of anything, but history, if you read the right history, it's the same stories, because all literature is based on some fiction. It all has happened. It just happens to be true, and I think that's a nice way to look at it, and a nice way to justify reading history, because it's just real literature. So. And man naturally despises those who court them, but respect those who do not give way to them. So this is very much, once again, alluding to the man being brutish and being cruel unless checked, unless covered by the oligarchs. So yeah, that's Socrates and Thucydides, and here is the comparison. So in terms of similarities, they both oppose democracy, as I've mentioned many times. Or rather, they did not support democracy, especially in the case of Socrates. So maybe they didn't hate democracy, but they didn't support the democratic class at the time, and they saw potential risks of it if gone too far, which I think it did, especially considering Socrates was killed and Thucydides was exiled for something pretty much out of his own control. And they both supported many top oligarchic figures such as Alcibiades and Pericles. And they were both very poorly treated by Athens and their own home state, which is unfortunate, but it nonetheless did not hurt their ultimate influence. In terms of differences, they had very different styles. So Socrates taught solely through dialogues, whereas Thucydides expresses ideas solely through writing. So probably complete opposites in that respect. And I guess the main distinction, and the one I'll close it with, is that Socrates believed that all men were good. He even said in one of his paradoxes that no one desires evil, or no one errs or does wrong willingly or knowingly. Whereas Thucydides thought that man is evil, and unless checked, they will be evil. So one was sort of an optimist about human nature, and one was sort of a pessimist in terms of human nature. Who is right? Probably both, probably neither. I don't know, hard to say, up to you. But either way, once again, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope, as I mentioned earlier, you don't, for example, start reading all the Socrates literature out there and just believe everything that Socrates says. Believe some of it, be critical of it, and more importantly, find things that you disagree with. I think you'll learn more from doing that. So yeah, thank you for watching this video. I hope you watch some of the ones I will make in the future and some of the ones I have made in the past. Thanks so much. Bye.